For most of the 20th century, the story of civilization had a clear beginning. Somewhere around 10,000 years ago, humans in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East figured out how to grow crops and domesticate animals. This discovery, the Neolithic Revolution, changed everything. Settled communities replaced nomadic bands. Surplus food allowed specialization. Specialization allowed complexity. Complexity over centuries produced cities, writing, religion, and everything we call civilization. The sequence was clean, the logic was airtight, and the timeline was settled. Then, in 1994, a Kurdish shepherd named Shavak Yildiz noticed something unusual while walking his flock across a limestone ridge in the hills above the Harran Plain in southeastern Turkey. He saw a carved stone protruding from the ground. He reported it to a local museum. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived to investigate, and what Schmidt began uncovering over the following years demolished the clean sequence entirely. Göbekli Tepe was not a settlement, it was not a farm, it was not a city, it was a temple. A complex of massive circular enclosures, each ringed with T-shaped limestone pillars up to 6 meters tall and weighing up to 20 tons, carved with extraordinary bas-relief images of animals, birds, scorpions, and abstract symbols, and it had been built, the dating confirmed, around 11,600 years ago, before the invention of pottery, before domesticated grain, before any of the conditions that the standard model said were necessary for organized construction of this scale to be possible. The history books said civilization produced religion. Göbekli Tepe suggested that religion, or something that functioned like it, may have produced civilization. Klaus Schmidt spent the rest of his career at Göbekli Tepe before his death in 2014, and his conclusion, stated carefully but repeatedly, was that the site was built by hunter-gatherers. Not by settled farmers with surplus grain and organized labor, by people who were still, by the standard definitions, pre-civilized, people who hunted gazelle and gathered wild plants and moved with the seasons across the landscape of what is now southeastern Turkey. And yet these people had organized the quarrying, transport, and erection of stone pillars that would challenge a modern construction crew, had carved them with images of breathtaking detail, and had done this not once but repeatedly, building multiple enclosures over centuries before deliberately backfilling and burying the entire complex. The deliberate burial was itself a mystery. Göbekli Tepe was not abandoned. It was intentionally covered, sealed, preserved. Someone had taken enormous care to bury what they had taken enormous effort to build. Why? The answer, like almost everything about the site, was not obvious from the stones alone. What the stones could not tell Schmidt, what no amount of archaeological excavation could fully reveal, was who these people were in the deeper biological sense. Where did they come from? What population did they belong to? And what happened to them after the site was buried and the enclosures went silent? The ancient DNA was waiting in the bones of their descendants, and when it was finally read, it rewrote not just the story of Göbekli Tepe, but the story of how civilization itself began. The genomic study that changed the conversation about Göbekli Tepe was not published about the site itself. The preservation conditions at the site have yielded very limited biological material suitable for ancient DNA analysis. Instead, the crucial genetic work came from a series of comprehensive studies of ancient populations across the Fertile Crescent and Anatolia, particularly a landmark 2019 paper in Cell, led by researchers including David Reich at Harvard and Ron Pinhasi at the University of Vienna, which analyzed ancient genomes from multiple sites across the region, spanning the critical transition period from the pre-agricultural to the early agricultural Neolithic. What those studies revealed about the population that built Göbekli Tepe and lived in the broader region of southeastern Turkey and northern Syria during the pre-pottery Neolithic period was startling in its implications. The people of this region, the population to which the Göbekli Tepe builders almost certainly belonged, were genetically distinct from the populations to the west and north of them. They belonged to what researchers designate as the Anatolian and Levantine Neolithic lineages, ancient genetic clusters whose ancestry can be traced through the hunter-gatherer populations of the Middle East, back into the deep Paleolithic. They were not newcomers. They had been in this region, or in the broader zone of the Fertile Crescent, for tens of thousands of years before the first stone was erected at Göbekli Tepe. But here is what the ancient DNA revealed that no archaeology could have told us. These people, the builders of the world's oldest known temple complex, did not simply stay in southeastern Turkey and gradually develop into the farming societies that would eventually spread agriculture across the world. They dispersed in multiple directions, at different times, and their dispersal was the mechanism through which the Neolithic Revolution actually spread. The standard model of the Neolithic Revolution had imagined it primarily as a diffusion of ideas. Agriculture, the model suggested, spread from the Fertile Crescent outward because neighboring peoples observed the advantages of farming, adopted the techniques, and passed them on. Genes would have stayed largely in place while knowledge traveled. The ancient DNA showed the opposite. Agriculture spread because people moved. The genomic signature of Fertile Crescent populations, specifically populations closely related to the Göbekli Tepe builders, appears across Anatolia, across the Aegean, across Europe, across South Asia, in patterns that can only be explained by actual migration, by the physical movement of people carrying their seeds, their animals, their knowledge, and their genomes into new territories. The Neolithic Revolution was not primarily a diffusion of technology, it was a diaspora. The implications for Göbekli Tepe are profound. The people who built the temple complex were not a local curiosity, a brief fluorescence of architectural sophistication that then faded without consequence. They were, or were closely related to, the founding population of one of the most consequential demographic expansions in human history. The descendants of the Göbekli Tepe builders, or of the broader population to which they belonged, are the ancestors of much of the modern population of Europe, South Asia, and the Middle East. They are, in a very real genomic sense, among the most influential people who ever lived, and we knew almost nothing about them until ancient DNA made their story readable. There is a specific finding within the ancient DNA research that deserves particular attention because of how it reorients everything we thought we understood about the transition from hunting and gathering to farming. The genomic data shows that the agricultural revolution in the Fertile Crescent was not a single event in a single place. It happened, essentially simultaneously, in multiple distinct populations across the broader region, populations that were genetically different from each other, that had been separated for thousands of years before they each independently began developing the same suite of agricultural practices. This means that agriculture was not invented once and adopted by everyone else. It emerged multiple times, in multiple populations, across a relatively short period of time, in the same broad region, and the trigger for this simultaneous emergence, whatever it was, is one of the most profound unsolved questions in the history of our species. Göbekli Tepe sits at the center of this question, because the construction of a massive ceremonial complex, requiring levels of organized labor that we previously assumed only farming societies could sustain, predates the emergence of farming itself by perhaps 1,000 years, which means that the sequence we had assumed, farming creates surplus, surplus creates organization, organization creates monuments, was wrong. Organization, perhaps driven by communal ritual, may have come first. An organization, once established, may have created the conditions under which farming became possible, rather than the other way around. Schmidt himself proposed this argument explicitly in the years before his death. The gathering of communities for seasonal rituals at places like Göbekli Tepe, he suggested, created population concentrations that put pressure on wild food supplies. That pressure created the incentive to begin managing and eventually cultivating the plants and animals that ritual gatherers were already using. The temple built the farmer, not the other way around. The ancient DNA cannot confirm this specific causal argument, but it can confirm that the population of the broader Göbekli Tepe region was the founding population of the agricultural expansion, that the people who gathered at this extraordinary site were the biological ancestors of the civilization that would follow them, and that whatever was happening on that limestone ridge in the hills above the Harran Plain 12,000 years ago was not peripheral to the human story. It was, in some sense we are still trying to fully understand, its origin. There is a question that the archaeology raises, and the genetics deepens, and it concerns the deliberate burial. Göbekli Tepe was sealed. Every enclosure was filled, carefully, intentionally, with soil and stone debris. The builders did not simply abandon what they had built. They preserved it, hid it, sent it forward in time, in a form that would survive. Why? We do not know. We may never know. The people who buried Göbekli Tepe left no written record, no explanatory text, no interpretive key. They left the stones themselves, carved with animals whose significance we can only guess at, arranged in patterns whose meaning we cannot read. And they left, in the soil, the biological remnants from which their genomic story has been partially recovered. That recovery is itself a kind of archaeology, reading what could not be written, finding in the molecules of ancient bones the population history that the carvers of Göbekli Tepe had no way of knowing they were creating. They did not know they were the ancestors of European farmers. They did not know their genes would travel to South Asia and the British Isles and the Nile Delta. They did not know that 12,000 years later, a technology that they could not have imagined would find in their biological remains the evidence that placed them at the origin of the story. They knew only that the stones had to be carved, that the enclosures had to be built, that the rituals had to be performed, and that when it was time, the whole thing had to be buried, sealed, sent forward. In some meaningful sense, it worked. The message arrived. Not the message they intended, whatever that was, but a message that turns out to be just as important. That civilization did not begin with farming. That organization came before agriculture. That the people who built the first monuments on Earth were not primitive beginners stumbling toward complexity. They were already capable of something we struggle to fully explain, something that required planning across generations, the coordination of hundreds of people with no apparent economic incentive to cooperate, and an understanding of stone and symbol and meaning that produced images still striking 12,000 years later. The Göbekli Tepe builders were never what we thought they were, because we never thought about them at all. They existed before the category of civilization that we use to think about the past, built before the conditions that were supposed to make their building possible, and then buried themselves so completely that they almost succeeded in removing themselves from history entirely. The DNA found them anyway, and what it found, at the origin of everything we call civilization, were not primitive humans groping toward complexity. They were people who had already grasped something essential about what it means to gather, to build, to remember, and to send the work forward into a future they could not see. That is not the beginning of civilization. That is civilization itself, already present at the start, waiting for the rest of history to catch up.